All right. So today we're going to learn how to connect our backend to our front end. As mentioned, I'll update the curriculum calendar, but where we're at is Jason, like you were saying, we finished Django and we did the authentication lesson yesterday. And now in module 8 in this full stack dependency lesson, we're on lesson 1 here, full stack auth. And in fact, the first thing that we're going to do in just a minute is there's a whole front end and back end app built out that we'll kind of, I think, quickly walk through. But before we do that, let me quickly go over our agenda for the day. So, we're going to talk about something called cross-origin resource sharing, which is sort of the big gotcha in connecting the back end and the front end. It's a core security feature of browsers and the web. So it is extremely important to know about and have some awareness of. And then we'll see sort of the workarounds we have to do for development. Um, we're going to see how we can sort of level up with Axios and set some defaults so that we don't have to build an Axios request from scratch every single time now that we have to start thinking about like saving an auth token in our React app and things like that. Along those lines, we'll see how to save an auth token in browser local storage. We'll talk a little bit about security considerations there. And then we'll implement, it's going to be mostly front end code, but logic for creating a user account or registration, logging in and logging out. We'll talk a little bit about sort of like user flow issues for working with data, including like when we need to refresh the page to refetch data, kind of like Noah, how you were showing in your demo at the end of the day. And we'll also see how to set up front end authentication in our front end app because I want to make sure that, if someone puts in like the URL to view the user profile in our front end app, that it doesn't, you have to log in to do certain things, to see certain pages. If there's time, we'll talk about for React, we can actually make a .env file for environment variables for our front end, but we may not get there today. So it's a pretty full plate, but it's a lot of good stuff. And we'll see how to connect the front end and the back end, and we'll be leveraging everything that we've been doing in Django. Um, I will take breaks, but because this is a pretty full lesson, and and in fact, I'm actually not sure we have an assignment for this one because really after this is the personal project. And also because each of these builds on the last, we'll probably just take enough breaks because there's not really a hands-on workshop to go along with this, if that makes sense. Does that sound good? And do folks have any questions? Okay, awesome. So let's take a quick look at the code base we're going to be working with. And again, if you want to pull up the curriculum, I'll try to kind of keep it to the side when it makes sense, but it's the first lesson in our full stack dependency module. And over here, we have also in our curriculum repo an app called Deployment App. And you can see that the big thing now is there's a lot of different ways to organize your front end and your back end. The most common approach is actually two separate repos where there's just a completely separate GitHub repo for the front end and one for the back end. For teaching purposes and also to make deployment to AWS easier, we're showing it's sometimes called a mono repo, mono as in like single, like monorail, like one rail. Um, Google famously actually has its whole code base in like one giant repo in a mono repo organization, though they don't use Git. So we have our back end with Django and our front end here. And I needed just a little extra time to get all this set up, but we see that we have it here. Um, how's this color scheme, by the way? Do you all prefer the dark mode or is this good?
I think this is good.
Okay, cool. So let's start with the back end because that's what we're familiar with. I've gone ahead and I have two shell sessions, as to your question, Tim, open here. And you'll need to be doing this for full stack development. As you can see, one of these is going to be for Python. and I've just set the color to this one to be blue. The other one I've set to be red, and it's going to be for the front end dev server. So it seems to be giving me a complaint. We'll come back to that in a second. And I've gone ahead. I've put the .denv file in the backend directory. You can put it wherever you want. It's not a huge deal breaker. I should probably make a .getignore file here to ignore the .benv file, and we might as well ignore any and all PyCache directories that might get created. And you can have multiple .getignore files in a repo, which can be very useful. So this is a to-do list app. If we look just very quickly, let's take a look at settings py in the project directory. We can kind of go from the top here. And we see that we haven't set up any sort of .env file with stuff, which is fine for today's lesson for learning purposes. We see there's a couple different apps we've created, right? We have Django REST Framework installed. We have the auth token set up for Django REST Framework. And we have a Django app for to-do lists, for tasks, for subtasks, and then for users. If we kind of just keep scrolling through here, you see the database is named to-do-db, and I have already set up and created that database and applied some migrations. And then we see the sort of password validation logic. And most importantly here for the user model, we see we're using a custom user app user model. And this is what we learned about yesterday, right? If I go into, well, let's continue our journey here actually with URLs py, and let's see our routing. And we see here what should look like a relatively standard routing setup. We've got API users, API lists. Let's start with the user. And if I go to URLs py for the user, I see there's a sign up, a login, a logout, route, and then we have some different view functions, to handle get, post, put, requests, and so on. And so if we just and we're just walking through like when Django handles an HTTP request, this is the flow of execution. And so now we get to the views for the user, and we see for sign up, there's a post endpoint, and we're doing all the things we learned yesterday. Note that we're grabbing the email or the username, but we're setting it to username, so I can pass username or email depending on what I prefer. I'm creating a new user. We're even worrying about serializers. We're just using a model to save it. And then here's what we learned yesterday, this login step. And then also creating a token for our user, and then we return a response that the user's been created. And I think we're going to do this in just a moment with Postman. We'll make it ourselves a user. And we've got a login endpoint where, again, this should look familiar from yesterday, where we're grabbing the username. And note that we look for a username, but if there's not one, we'll grab an email. We use the authenticate function that checks the password to see if it's correct. If it indeed is a correct password, we will then log in the user, create an auth token, and return that token in the body of our JSON response. I just want to pause and check in to see if folks have any questions as we do this review.
Is this going to be uploaded to demos and notes later?
This whole repo is right here
Oh,
in Code Platoon curriculum. And I will push all of this that we're going to add to demos and notes.
okay. Where,
Yeah,
where is the deployment app in the curriculum?
if you just go to today's lesson, it's linked right
Oh,
here.
okay, sounds
Yeah,
good.
that's going to be the easiest way to get there. Yeah, good question. So there's a lot of code here, right? But hopefully now we're starting to get more familiar with Django. Like we're starting to get more comfortable with these patterns. And I just want to, again, walk us through this to help us orient before we add stuff. And as you can see, I obviously did not write all this. And, honestly, a lot of the times when I'm looking at code, I do find it a bit easier to just look at it here in GitHub. I don't know if you want to look if this is an easier way to read this code. Um, but the whole app is there and you can find it in today's lesson.
Could you
Um,
could you scroll up just a little bit to the sign up?
yeah. Which line were you curious about?
I'm curious. Yesterday, Francisco told us in order to create the user, we have to use the create user method. Otherwise, it doesn't work, and I don't see you having used that.
Oh, we probably should use create user instead of new user dot save.
Yeah, that won't work how it is.
Yeah, let's when we get there, if it fails for us, then we'll know what the problem is and we'll modify it accordingly.
All right.
And in just a couple minutes, I'm going to start using Postman to creating users and stuff. That's a really good point. We may need to update this repo. Um, just to finish our tour here, we have this token. And did we see this pattern yesterday as well? And this is really a helper for us because there's different ways to authenticate in Django, right? Different approaches. And if we're doing it with the token in the HTTP request, we have some settings that we have to set for token authentication. And then whatever view functions really related to endpoints that we need the user to be logged in for, like logging out, getting information about the user, it can just inherit from this token rec class to get these things, which is a really nice pattern. Um, Logging out, relatively straightforward. Getting information about the user. Here, you can see that we actually have a put request here to update a user's information. So I can change a user's display name, age, address, and so on. Let's take a look at our backend for the list app, and then we'll take a look a little bit at the front end, and then we'll start connecting these dots. So we've walked through users. If I kind of go back to, and this is a good way to orient yourself, especially as your projects get bigger, by the way. Um, let's leave that one up because we're gonna come back to that one. But I get a little obsessive about organizing my code. So we actually are going to save and close that. And I get a little obsessive about organizing like the tabs of how I organize stuff. And I try to keep everything left to right. So like if the request comes in here, like the next tab that I want is, if we're looking now at the lists app, I want to open that up. And it drives me a little nuts that I actually like multiple tabs. I don't like that VS Code replaces it. But we can see here with the list, we've got we can get information about a list and we can get tasks. We see at this point, this route actually goes to our task app. So let's actually do a split here and let's open up the URLs py for tasks. And that should be over there. And so I can get information about a list, probably create a list, but for tasks in that list, we go here and then there's this all tasks. So let's take a quick look at the views for lists. And if we look over here, what we see is relatively straightforward. We can get a list, right, and get information about it. We can create a list. Um, and here we do need to get user information. And we see this token rep that we've imported and used. So you have to be logged in to create a list. And then for an individual list, I can grab the list. Again, I have to be logged in to create a list. Um, this looks like we might have, oh, this is a helper function. This actually returns the list. Here's where we modify a list, right? It's a put request, and we can see that we grab the list and we basically modify it with whatever data we're passing, probably just changing the list name and deleting a list. So that really covers everything we can do with lists. Now let's take a look at tasks. And I don't think I'm going to worry about subtasks too much today. Between lists and tasks, that gets us pretty far. And we can see over here, again, we can get a task. I have to be logged in to do it. And I can create a task, right? And we actually don't have a put or a modify for a task, which I think is totally fine.
So this would all error out if you tried to do it without the user being logged in.
Correct. You'd get some sort of Django response, like unauthorized HTTP response with an error code. And in fact, we can go ahead and we can try that now. Like let's try to create a list when we're not logged in. So let me close this out, and we've got all lists over here. Let me spin up my Django server. So that should be running. And if I go over here, I was trying to get the admin set up. There's actually some stuff we have to fiddle with now that we have our own user accounts. We want to go to /API lists. Actually, I'm going to need to make a post request. I totally forgot. And it's just API lists. We didn't add V1 for this one. And in fact, we can see right here, Jason, to answer your question, we just get this sort of automatic response from Django. Authentication credentials were not provided, right? And if I do this same thing in Postman, and let's put Postman over here, and let's just do like HTTP, localhost. I know this font size is small for Postman. If that becomes an issue, let me know and I'll bump it up, but I think we're okay here. And I think it's lists. Yep, API/lists. We send it and we get the same detail. Authentication credentials were not provided. And it's a 401 response. If we look
Um,
here in the HTTP headers, we can see there's somewhere there it is. They put it there, a 401 unauthorized, and we can see here in our logs for Django the 401 response as well. Yes, someone had a question.
oh, sorry, another one. For the API views, I noticed that Francisco yesterday had the option to post. So if you go back to the API view screen, the one that you had, just the one that's just behind Postman. Yeah, there was a window below that allowed you to post, and allowed you to select like JSON and all that yesterday. It was
Oh,
literally
with
right below it, like a window, like a window below. Like he
with
had
Django REST framework.
maybe, yeah, it was on there. Yeah,
Good
Maybe
question.
maybe he has a different setup.
I might have to set something up. There might be like a helper utility library.
Okay.
Um, I wonder if we have to be logged in, if that's an issue here. I'm not really sure. Does anyone know how Francisco got that there yesterday?
I mean, it was just already there, I think.
Does anyone know if that's like native to Django REST framework or if there's an extra configuration step I need?
I don't remember how you get it to show, but it just essentially lets you write a body and you send a request through that window and it'll automatically like populate the information you provide.
Does anyone know if I need to deal with the auth token somehow to do that?
If it gets us too off track, it's okay.
Well, we can take like 30 seconds here, I think. But then we'll move on. I realized I was kind of asking leading questions here. Um, but in part, I wanted to point out like we're getting to the point where a lot of this stuff is complex enough where like we might have pieces missing or I don't know the answers. I would love to add that. So if someone can actually maybe like ask Francisco if we get that for free or how we can add that in, then we can add that in because I actually that would be really nice. It looks like maybe it's one of these third party packages. I don't know. I'll follow up later, but actually, I'd really appreciate if someone could do that, and because that's good for you guys to learn about too. Um,
Isn't it just the class that was defined has to have a post method within it in order to show up in the API view?
That's possible.
Uh, Possible. All lists does have a post method right here. So we do have a post method for the API view.
Hmm.
But we also do have to be logged in to do it. So I don't know is the short answer.
Oh, okay. But you can't log in using the browser. You have to use the Postman in order to log in because of the
Yeah,
token, right?
maybe we do. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, we'll come back to that one later. I don't want to get too lost in the sauce with it now. And I think I'll just stick with Postman 2 for making requests. Can everyone see this okay? By the way, I realize these fonts are tiny. Okay. And
Yeah, it's
on
a
the
little
same
small,
thing
but I
here.
can see it okay.
There we go. How's that?
Yeah.
Hopefully that's better.
I think the issue is your create user doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, let's in fact go ahead and create a user and see how we do with that. Because we may indeed have an issue there. So if I'm going to open up my views, let's go to our user. We need to hit this sign up endpoint and we need to pass an email. And I think that's really the main thing. I haven't really looked at the models, but we can take a quick look. Um, I probably need what email, age, that's probably about it. And just to sort of remind myself of the routing, it looks like it's just sign up. So I should be able to do a post to API sign up, and we'll just save this here. We'll call it to do. I'm going to try and save these as I go. Um, and then in the body, which is going to be JSON, we're going to need an email, which is going to be adam@coplatoon.org. Um, do we need a password? Um, we do need a password. So we need an email and a password. And the password is just going to be password. And let's see, this may work even if it's not the best way, or indeed we may need to modify this code. 404 not found. Probably because I have an incorrect URL there. Page not found, localhost 8000. Probably because I'm just forgetting part of the user's URLs PY here. So let's just pull up our main URLs PY and see what I'm missing. And indeed, I need API/user/signup. And now we're off to the races. And this did actually appear to work. I don't remember off the top of my head
It didn't
what.
work. Your token was generated, but your user wasn't.
Oh, I see what you're saying. User unknown. Uh, Interesting. Okay. I actually don't remember the create user off the top of my head. Let's quickly modify this to get this working. Can someone walk me through what are the changes I need to make here to create this user?
You just new user equals whatever the user model is, dot objects, dot create user, and then deconstruct data or request, whatever, yeah, you're using data.
Yeah, you know what? Actually, even better, now that I'm thinking about this, let's just pull this up from yesterday. Because I don't want to get, I know it's easy for me to make a mistake and to get too lost in the sauce. The token did get created though. So I do,
That's because token's a separate section. It says token equals token dot objects dot create, and then user is a variable you created, but that doesn't mean it tied it to the user.
yeah, I would have expected Django to air out. Um, I'm a little surprised it didn't. Because I also would have expected the login to fail. I wonder if the issue here is that there's no display name. Um, if I'm being totally honest, let's actually try this because I am curious.
Actually looks correct. I don't know.
Um, this is, and even if this does work, I think you are right that that's the better way to do it. But let's see what we get. So yeah, I think this actually is working because we see the user printed. Save seems to work. If I go in here and I do pSQL and we connect to do DB and we look at tables, what is it? User app user. And we see in here Adam and Bob. So the point here is not that this is the best way to do that. Tim, I do think you're right that we should use the Django create user method. Um, but I did want to walk through this to point out two things. One is that it's often the case that there's more than one way to do things, but one way isn't necessarily the best. And I do think this code should be refactored for future use to use the create user method. There could be an issue we're running into, and we might do that in a moment. But the other thing, and this is where it gets really tricky, like now that we have data in a database that we format responses and stuff, it's very easy to lose track of what we're looking at. And here in the response, because it sends back the display name specifically, it becomes easy, right? We see that this is unknown. And in fact, I would argue this is actually a bad pattern, and we should send back like the whole user as a JSON object, or we should like return new user dot email or something where it'll always be there so that this actually does give us good data. Let's go ahead and make this change though, because I don't want to kind of end up running into an issue. That create Django's create user is doing something that's important for us. And also this way we can have some consistency. And let's see, where is it under trainer? Yeah, trainer objects, create user, data, token. I apologize. I'm actually not going to refactor this now. I just don't want to introduce issues. If we run into a problem, we'll circle back. But we probably should be using create user here. Because I don't want to have to worry about like with star quargs on this data. Is there something in the shape here I need to change, and that kind of stuff. So as long as it's not broken, I'm just going to keep rolling with it. But this is good because we've created a user, and I've gotten back an auth token. And what I like to do is, and you can see how many tabs we end up with open here. I'm going to activate the virtual environment just so I don't forget here. I like to make just like a scratch file. And honestly, I'll just put stuff in here. So Bob at codeplatoon.org, his password is password, and the token is this. I find this way easier in terms of keeping track of stuff. Now let's go ahead and log in. And we should have a login endpoint if we check here. And indeed we do. API/users/login. And indeed, that seems to work. And in fact, we get back a fresh token. In fact, it looks like it is the same token as before. Let's see if we have a log out working. We do. So let's get rid of this and let's log out. We're just going to kind of kick the tires on everything real quick. To log out, I actually need to provide some authentication details. Can anyone remind me, how do I pass this auth token once I'm logged in to log out in my request? Do I pass it here in the JSON body?
Don't you pass in the headers?
Yeah, I passed it in as a header. What's the header name that I need to have here?
Token.
authorization with a
Oh,
capital A.
yeah, you're right. The value is token.
Yeah, exactly. And then the value is our token.
You
No,
also
Now let's
need
see.
it's token
token.
space and then the token.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Uh, like, like so?
It's a space, not a return.
Yeah, it is a space.
Oh,
That's
okay.
just, yeah. But I appreciate the
It's just
check
right.
there because that's an easy
Right.
mistake. And now, we get a 204 response, which is one of the success response codes. So we see that we were indeed logged out. Um, and we should be able to now, again, log back in. Let's like undo this header. Let's put our body back. And in fact, I'm going to save this because this is nice to have. I like having a text file instead of, you can save all this in Postman, but I really like having the text file. And now we've got a new token. So in fact, our old token is gone. It wouldn't work if we wanted to. And we can, in fact, with our new token, let's go ahead and copy this and put this in here. We should be able to do users slash, I want to say it's info, and do a get request. And if I don't pass that header, we get a page not found. But I think the issue there may be authorization related. No, it looks like it's indeed related to the pathing. Let's take a quick look at our URLs py for our user. And we don't even need to say info. That was just me forgetting. So we should just be able to do API slash users. And let's look at the view here. In fact, I'm a little surprised that there's not, we don't even have a get request for info. So let's just maybe make one real quick. And we can say get try data our user request that user return response. And let's just put the user there. And if that doesn't work, we will copy a little bit of this and we'll just, in fact, copy this whole bit right here. And we'll probably come back to this. But let's just see if we can get that working. And let's see. I wonder if there's still an indentation error. It looks like I have an indentation error hiding. There we go. Sorry about that. In fact, maybe we can just format this. And I think that indentation error should be gone now. And now if we do our request, we need to do a bit more with this user data. And I'm going to do this kind of quick and dirty because I don't think we have a user serializer. So I think what I'm just going to do is return, you know, uh, display name, our user dot display name, email, our user dot email, and how about age? And that ought to be enough to get us going. And so now I have a get endpoint, and this will be useful when we work with our front end. So we've kind of kicked the tires on this. The next step here is to make some lists, right? I definitely need to like create a list. So, and let me pause because I know I've been doing a lot of talking and I just want to check in to see if folks have questions thus far. And also if we feel like we're getting more oriented in this code base. How are we doing?
I'm kind of in the middle. I was about to ask if it would be possible to get like a TL draw, but I'm not even really sure what I need to see right now, to be honest.
Got it. Yeah. I think the quick TL draw would be actually what we should have here is, and actually that's a really good point. So the high level overview of our Django backend that we've been interacting with here is we have an app, user app, we have a list app, we have a task app in models, we have subtasks, and then we have these endpoints to get a user or just to test, to deal with users, sign up, login, and then we have lists and tasks. And I've sort of been moving through the code, but also really just making post requests so we have some data, right? Because now that I have an auth key, what I really want to do is I want to make a list. And to do that, I need a user who's logged in. And then I probably need the name of my list. And I'm going to do like a quick hop over to the list app to see what we need to make a list. And I probably need to hop over to the list model. And really, we just need a name is the only thing that our list needs. So over here, let's make a list. Let's just call it list one. Let's go ahead and create it. It looks like it wants me to add tasks. It needs a tasks array. We're not going to have any tasks, so I'm going to give it an empty list. And let's see, we may actually be running into an issue here with tasks and tasks being empty and list creation. If so, I apologize. Um, yeah, I'm a little surprised we have to deal with a tasks array here when creating this. We may need to make a quick modification here. Let's try read only equals true. I think that may resolve our issue. Let's see what
Read
happens.
underscore only.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering why I wasn't getting the autocomplete. There we go. So the issue I ran into here and that we need to fix in our code was because we're creating a list with the serializer is, basically expecting all the fields it needs for validation, which includes a tasks array or a tasks list. But when we're creating a list with no tasks, or even if we put tasks in here, we would have run into an issue trying to create it because the serializer isn't set up for that. And thank you for the help there, Jack. So we need to tell the serializer that with this special property tasks, that's a bunch of tasks. The serializer's job isn't to stick stuff into the database, it's only to get it out of it. Now I indeed should have a list and it's got an ID of 1. And I'm going to dump this in my sort of scratch file. And I'm just going to make a note here and we'll call it list 1. And now if I want to, we can take a look at list 1. And there's not very much in here that's interesting, right? But let's create a couple tasks. And I am going to sort of hop over here to our API reference real quick, and we see tasks. We need to do a post. A task undoubtedly needs some sort of name. And if we take a look in our task app and we look at the models, we see that really what it needs is a description. And that's about it. I think the parent list should be set and created for us. So let's try creating a task with a description. Let's just call it get milk. That's sort of the classic task, right? Get the milk. And let's see if this works. And indeed, we need a name and description. And now we've created a task. And I'm going to stick this in my Scratch file as well. So it took us a while here, but we've also seen like how to explore an API. We've seen how, if we don't have an API reference, how we can navigate through the code base to do this, and how the sort of just what the workflow for doing this is. But now I've got enough to work with here, right? Because I have a user, I have a list, and I have tasks. And now if I go
I'm
back and I
sorry.
look at, yeah,
I have a question. The parent list on line 27 being 1, is that in reference to the ID of list 1 being 1?
exactly.
Okay.
It's exactly what it is. Yeah, good question. Um, yeah, I won't go to the code where we set that, but you guys could sort of imagine how we do that and we can navigate in the code base to see it. But this is also where you can see how just kind of exploring the API can be useful. And now we can see if I hit the lists endpoint, we get all of our lists and all their tasks, and we only have one list with one task. And if I want to see information about that one list, I can see information about that list where it only has one task, and we see some information about the list, including the user that it belongs to. So this has been a lot of backend stuff and a lot of setup. Let's start looking at our front end so we can connect the pieces together. And I realize we're almost at the hour. So I think what I'll do is let's very quickly look at what the front end code looks like, and then we can take 10, and then we can start connecting the two. Sound good? Okay,
Yes, indeed.
cool. Awesome. So let's, in fact, close out most of this stuff. I am going to keep the Scratch file open. As I said, I highly recommend once you start doing full stack stuff, just having a file like this that you just keep open all the time. I think it makes it very simple. Sometimes I use a different text editor, so it's not in VS Code at all. Our front end code is relatively straightforward right now. If we look in app.jsx, we see a nav bar, we see React router. If we take a quick look at our nav bar, we see there's a home page, there's a sign up page, and a login page. And if we take a look at our routing, we see we've got homepage, sign up, login, and that's really it. If we look at the pages, sign up doesn't have anything yet. Login doesn't have anything yet. These are what we're going to build. Homepage doesn't even have anything yet, right? We have not connected this to our backend at all. And we're going to write all the code we need here, both to log in, log out, and view lists. And it took a while for us to do this, but now we're familiar with the API. And also, we have the data that we need. So I can really test as I go with my front end now. And if I go over here and navigate to my front end directory and just do npm run dev, and we hop over to the browser, which has sort of navigated over, we can see we've got a very simple app going, right? So Django REST framework, I'm not sure how to set up the authentication stuff, to be honest. I'm a bit more used to using Postman or another tool like this once I really kind of get into the weeds of doing work. You can save multiple Postman requests, by the way, if you want to. Like here we have get lists. If we wanted to, we could save this as create user.
Adam, what did you mean exactly uh, about you're not sure about restricting the authentication stuff? Like how to get a view to be restricted by authentication to have a token?
Oh,
Or
no, just with Django REST framework and the UI here, right now, like hitting the lists endpoint doesn't do us any good because we need to be logged in to view lists.
Mhm.
So there's probably a way with the Django REST framework UI to deal with that. Not the code itself, but literally just this page we're seeing in the browser. But I'm just more used to using Postman, like at this point, to interact with an API. And I think it is worth getting comfortable with Postman because there's just so much more that we'll need to do here with auth headers and stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's take 10, get away from the screen. And then when we come back, we will start writing our front end code. I'll also drop the link to this to do app in Slack if anyone wants to look at it during the break. Thank you very much, folks, and I'll see you all in 10 minutes. All right. So we've spent a lot of time exploring our API, and we have all these different endpoints. Um, there were a couple issues in the code base that we fixed, but we've kicked the tires. We've navigated through stuff. And in Postman now, we can create a user. I can view a list of lists. I can view the tasks in that list. I'm doing all this as a logged in user, right? So far, so good. I've also added a test endpoint in lists test, and note that this is not authenticated. And when we start writing front end code, this will be useful as we just start to get the ball rolling. And all it does is just send back a message just so that we know that it works. So let's take a quick look at TLDraw and talk about this is often called like the web flow or HTTP flow. And then we will start writing code. But as soon as we start writing code with Vite, we're going to run into something that's going to involve having to deal with the fact that we have multiple servers running. So I want to kind of preview that now. So right now, I'll just open up the network tab here. All this stuff happens, but the first thing that happens is our browser makes a GET request to localhost port 5173, which is where I have my Vite dev server running, right? And this is totally independent of Django. Doesn't matter if Django's running or not, Django server is running. None of that matters. And then the browser makes that request, and what gets sent back is an HTML page. And then all of our React code gets loaded in there, right? And if we poke around a little bit, we see this index.html page in our front end code. and we see here the critical line of code, script, blah, 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 source main.jsx. And this is what loads all of our React. So at the moment, what we've got is, and let's go ahead and let's HTTP localhost 5173. And Django's running on port 8000. And we've got get, slash index.html. And the Vite dev server says, awesome, let's send you back the index.html. And, it says like 200 okay or something like that in the response. And we get back the index.html page. And then the browser does what all browsers do with HTML pages, and it reads it line by line. And then when it gets to this script tag, what browsers do for script tags, for image assets, for CSS files, is they make more HTTP GET requests. And in fact, if we look somewhere in here, we can see here's the GET request that grabbed index.css, bootstrap.min, and somewhere in here we go, is the one that grabs main.jsx. And this is how browsers behave natively, so that when it loads an HTML page, it can load image files, CSS files, and other assets, but it does it by making more GET requests to the server. And I'm going to remove this from the responses so it's a bit easier to read. And so now the browser's like, cool, get me source main.jsx. There's a little bit more going on under the hood there, but it's not worth getting into at the moment. And our Vite dev server responds back. It gives it indeed source main.jsx. The Vite dev server actually bundles all of our JavaScript into here. And even more of this stuff is happening. And we haven't even talked to Django yet. The browser does the same thing to get the CSS, right? It says get, I don't know, source index.css or wherever it lives. And so far, this hasn't really mattered, but it is in just a moment going to start mattering a lot. The fact that the browser is making all these requests over here, and we're going to run into cross-origin resource sharing when we go to another origin or host or URL over here with Django. And I just want to check in if folks have questions sort of about this. I've heard this called like an HTTP request flow diagram or a web flow diagram, because I don't think we've explicitly seen this before. And this is a really helpful way of building a mental model of what our front end and back end are doing. So I do just want to check in with folks to see if people have any questions.
No,
You
that was
just
pretty
like
clear for me. Oh, sorry.
can you just like go over one more time quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. So over here, when I paste this URL in and hit enter, what does the browser do? The browser makes a GET request to that host, right? The domain name, the IP address, the origin, and we have here like a host name and a port. And it's making a GET request the same way we could with Postman. And in fact, we can do this with Postman right now. And Postman sends back, the Vite dev server sends back HTML from this index.html page. And there's a whole bunch of stuff in here. There's a whole script, and this is how the hop module reloading works. We don't have to worry about this, but this does cause the browser to make a bunch more HTTP requests. We see there's another script here that actually Vite has inserted for us that loads more stuff, and maybe this is what's doing the hop module reloading. But the main thing is over here, this script tag that points to our main.jsx JavaScript. And the way that browsers work is whenever there's a script tag, it will either run the JavaScript inside of it, or if there's this source attribute here, it will make another HTTP GET request. And it does the same thing with CSS files and image assets. And a browser goes through an HTML file line by line, and it renders everything it can. And then when it gets to something like this, it says, oh, my job isn't to render this. My job is to send a GET request to the server for that asset. Like that. Now, the JavaScript that we're seeing here, it's called being minified. Vite Dev Server does a whole bunch of stuff under the hood to our JavaScript code that's not worth getting into now to sort of compress it. But this is, in essence, all of the JavaScript for our whole React app bundled up into one file. And so, and this is how, like, when I go to Wikipedia and let's find a page about the cat, and let's go to the network tab, and let's clear this, and let's refresh this. So the first HTTP request is always for some sort of page. Right? Cat. And the response is an HTML file with a ton of stuff. And this is the whole HTML file for this article on the cat. But in there, when we say we get to an image tag, the browser makes another HTTP GET request to get that image from the server, right? And that's how a browser reads an HTML file and loads in images and loads in CSS and loads in JavaScript code that it then runs. And I just want to check in to see if that makes sense to folks and if folks have questions, because that's sort of a key piece.
Yeah, I think that helped a bit.
Awesome. Yeah. How are we feeling and sort of thinking about this? Cool. Just remember, a browser goes through an HTML file one line at a time, and it renders stuff, right? It builds the DOM and it renders stuff. But for certain kinds of tags or elements, when you see like a source attribute, it says that's telling the browser, this is an asset. You need to make a GET request to the server to get this asset. And the asset is almost always an image file, a JavaScript file with code, or like CSS. And then with the JavaScript, it gets run. So to kind of go back here, a whole lot is happening here when that first HTML page gets loaded, right? We see here, we're grabbing the client stuff, we grab main.jsx, and we grab all these other things. And so that's it. Like, if we kind of get into the dirty details, the series of HTTP GET requests and responses happening between the browser and the server just to load a web page, right? And then for us, because the browser is grabbing our React app, then the React starts running in here, and then React does its thing in the browser, and our React app starts up. And I just want to check in if folks have any questions thus far. Cool. So far, so good. Let's, now what we're going to do is we're going to have our browser talk to a different server, the server running our Django app. And just like Postman, it's going to make a GET request, and we're going to hit API lists test because that's an endpoint I put together during the break that does not require authentication. So we can keep life simple and we just get a response back. But as we do this, we're going to run into an issue because we have two different servers. And it turns out that browsers implement some security features around JavaScript code coming from one place, trying to talk to another place. Because think about if we go to like Citibank or Chase Bank and we load JavaScript code here, and then the JavaScript code says, cool, send the password you just typed in to, sketchy website.russia.ru. There's a real security risk if JavaScript from one URL or origin tries to talk to another, because maybe that's malicious JavaScript that a malicious hacker has somehow slipped in there. And the term here is cross-origin resource sharing, and we're about to see this happen in just a moment. So let's code this up and watch this in action. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close out most of this stuff that we don't need. I'm going to go to our front end code, and we're just going to add a little bit of code here in app.jsx. In fact, I'm going to install Axios because I think we want and need Axios. And now let's run our dev server. And now let's, I think we can just import Axios from Axios. Does that look right to folks?
Did you install Axios?
I did just install Axios, yes.
Then it should work.
Perfect. And let's write a little function here. Let's just have it be to test our connection. And it's going to be an async function. I know we haven't seen JavaScript in a minute. And what it's going to do is we're going to get a response. We're going to do axios.get, and I'm just going to hard code in here our Django server /API/lists/test. And let's just console log that response. And, we don't really need user stuff. Well, we'll come back to it later. But for now, really, let's just go ahead here and import a use effect so I can make an API call. And inside this use effect, let's go ahead and run this test connection method. I'll throw in a little debugging statement so we can see if we run into issues or not. And so if I look at the console log and I refresh, I see, if you all can see over here, this test connection gets printed. And then we have this really interesting error message. Access to XML HTTP request, blah, 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 at localhost 8000/API/list/test has been blocked by CORE's policy, no access control allow origin header is present. And if we look here in the network tab and we do a little filtering, and there's a lot of stuff here, so I know the network tab can get a little messy, but we look at this test request, we can see here a GET request was sent, but we see that we run into somewhere in the response headers, we should have, I'm not even sure if we get a response because the core has sort of short-circuited us. There is a way to see it, but probably the easiest thing is here looking in the console. And I'll make sure real quick, let's see, list/test. So I probably need a slash here at the end, but it won't make a difference because we still get the same error of this CORE's policy issue. So CORS stands for cross-origin resource sharing. And as I mentioned, it's built into browsers and it's designed to prevent JavaScript loaded from one origin, making HTTP requests to another, right? Because if someone malicious got some malicious JavaScript in here and this is my bank and this loads on my website and then I type in my username and password and the JavaScript talks to a different server, that's potentially a huge security hole. So this behavior has just been baked into browsers. And CORS, to be totally honest, is kind of confusing. I always have to kind of remind myself about this. I think the MDN site does a really good job of breaking it down. You can kind of see here they have like a Webflow diagram again, and it's the same basic concept where the HTML page came from one server, but then like having JavaScript or even like HTML, like a image asset with a source pointing somewhere else, we run into a potential cross-origin resource sharing issue. So the browser has this behavior baked in, and it's actually controlled by the server. And so we can actually change some Django features and settings that will solve this CORS issue for us. And if we look in probably the HTTP response from Django, if we look all the way, you all see all the way down here in these headers in this Django response, where there's this header cross origin opener policy and refer policy same origin. So we can actually modify this HTTP response header, and Django can tell the browser that like it's okay to have a cross origin request to get something here. So it's built into the browser, but it's kind of configured and controlled by HTTP headers, which I always get a little confused by, to be totally honest. And the same way, though, like our Vite dev server, like when it initially sends stuff over, it has a policy as well. If we go to, let's just refresh this and go to all. And we go all the way up to localhost. And we look here. Somewhere in the response headers, I think there should be a CORS policy. Though maybe not. Though there is this access control allow origin that's open. So what we need to do here, though, to resolve this issue is we need to change some Django configuration that will allow it to receive requests from other origins and Django not flag it as a security issue and stop it. And the good news here is because this is such a common thing, it's relatively easy to do. And I just want to pause and check in and see if folks have any questions before we start implementing some code. Okay, cool. And the thing to keep in mind here is there's going to be sort of two separate configurations for development and then for production. The good news here is that because this is such a common issue for software development, for Django, there's a really well-known package called Django CORS headers. And as it says here, it will allow in-browser requests to your Django application from other origins. So here, origin means like a different host name and port, as in localhost 5173 instead of localhost port 8000. Actually, I would say this woman, Julia Evans, is amazing. Francisco turned me on to her. She writes all these sort of like comics about software engineering stuff, but she must be a software engineer because she clearly knows her stuff. And I think this is now her profession. So I actually think these are really good starting points. And I'll share these links with folks later. And the good news here is setup here is pretty straightforward. So I am going to kill my Django dev server. I'm going to do pip install Django cores headers. And we've now installed it. I do now have to start changing stuff in my settings PY in the backend. So in the project. And we have to change a number of things. We have to go to installed apps, and we have to add cores headers as an app, and we can add this anywhere we want. But we also have to add this to our middleware. And this is actually important. We haven't really talked about middleware, and I don't want to talk about it too much, but the essence of it is when like an HTTP request comes in to Django, Django runs a lot of code automatically, and you can think of each of these things in this middleware list as a function. And note that the first one is security, and the next one is session related to authentication, then common, and we're about to add cores, and here's another authentication one. And so this is how, when we're writing our view code and we get that request object, this is why for authentication, request.users already exists there, and the HTTP request is an object because the raw data of the HTTP request has ran through all of these middleware functions, and Django does this in the order that these are defined. So for cores stuff, for cross-origin stuff, we want it to be after the security, but before we get to authentication. I believe that is the correct spot for it. And I just want to check in to see if folks have any questions. And middleware, by the way, is like a common architectural pattern that you'll see in a lot of web frameworks, not just with Django. So those should be the key steps now with Django cores. There is one more thing we need to do. We need to tell Django what origins are allowed. And I think we should just do it maybe here. And there's two ways to do it. One is we create a list named cores allowed origins. And you can see an example here. And in fact, I'm just going to copy and paste this. And you can see that this is an example of a domain or a host name. It could be an IP address. You can see this is a subdomain because of the little dot, sub.example.com, and then this is like a dev server. And this is some other dev server. So for us, these are just examples. What we really need, and you can have as many as you want here. What we need is HTTP, and no S is important because the S means secure and uses a different sort of like protocol for interpreting an HTTP request. We need HTTP localhost for 5173 that our Vite dev server is running on. Now, the problem here is this is great, but every now and then, what if something else is on 5173? What if I change it? That can become a real gotcha, right? And so the other way to do this, and the way that we recommend for local development, is we simply do cores allow all origins true. And in fact, this can live in like a .env file. And then when we deploy to the cloud for production, we set this to false. But for now, for us, For local dev and doing full stack work, this makes it really easy. And so now, fingers crossed, if I restart my server, my Django server, we have it running, right? And to go back to the diagram real quick, the issue here was we were getting, a CORS error. Hopefully now we get something else. So let's clear this and let's go to the console and clear this and let's refresh. And now indeed we see our HTTP response logged. If I poke around in here in the data property of the HTTP response, we see our message. If I go to the network tab and I do a little filtering so that we only see like JavaScript HTTP requests mainly, here we see the GET request that Axios made, and we see here the body of the response as well as the response headers. And if we look over here, let's see, cross-origin opener policy. There should be a different cross-origin policy from Django. I think the difference now is this access control allow origin has changed from Django, but don't quote me on that. As I said, to be honest, I get a little lost in the sauce with the specifics, but I think this is what's changed for us from before. And if we look at Postman, in fact, if we look at when we made this request in Postman before, so we don't even sort of run into this issue in Postman because Postman, like, this isn't, Postman is not coming from a different origin at all. So that's why we kind of only see the issue in the browser and particularly with Vite Dev Server. So it's relatively straightforward to set up. Just to recap, we install Django CORS headers. We add it to installed apps. We add it to the middleware, and we have to add it in the right spot. And we do have this laid out in the curriculum. And then we have to tell Django what origins or other URLs, essentially what host names, it will allow requests to be from. And then when we make this HTTP request from our React app to Django, Django's okay with it, and we don't get a CORS error back. We get what we want. So I just want to check in and see what questions folks have, because this is a pretty big concept, right? How are we feeling?
Pretty good. I do have like I guess a little question. I don't know. Inside the installed apps, I realized that we put like the course kind of in the middle above the apps that we created. Um, is there a reason for that? Like I know why we did it after security and whatnot, but I just didn't know if where we put inside the
Yeah.
installed apps mattered.
Yeah, great question. And it is confusing. Like order matters for middleware, as far as I know. Maybe it matters for installed apps, but it basically doesn't. As a habit, I like to keep stuff organized where all the core Django stuff is here, all like the third-party stuff we install is here, and then all the apps that like I create are here. Like, and if I was doing this for real, I might, add like, our apps, third party apps. I might add comments. So like, because as this gets bigger, sometimes it's nice to keep it organized. That's the only reason. What other questions do folks have? What else is on people's minds? Should we, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump in if there was a question. And let me actually take a quick look at our Zulu questions channel.
Yeah, if you're going to add that settings dot instead of in settings.py, you're going to add the core overwrite for local development in an env file. How would you reference that within the actual settings.py file?
Yeah, totally. Someone remind me again, what's the package name for installing the .env? Is it like,
I think it's just .env. Hold on. It's Python
yeah,
hyphen
I thought
.env.
Python/.env requirement already satisfied. So and then up here in settings py, I think we have to do something like from .env import, and was it load.env that we were using?
Yeah.
Yeah. And let's make a .env file. Let's open up our git ignore file real quick. Make sure we add the .env to that. Let's open up that .env file. And let's do course allow all origins equals true. And over here, I think what we do is we do like env equals load.env.env. And that probably needs to be in quotes. Does that look right to folks?
Yeah, that looks pretty good according to my memory.
Yeah. And what does load.env do again?
It just basically it takes env and makes it essentially a variable that links your env file and all contents into accessible variables within settings.py.
Yeah, very close. Specifically, what kind of variable do we get here on line 16? Is it a list?
Oh, I don't recall. Was it an
Yeah.
object or is it a list?
Dictionary. Very
Dictionary.
close. Dictionary. Yeah, but you're on the right path, right? And so now that we've got this, what I can do down here is cors allow all origins equals env.get cors allow all origins, right? And as long as I had spelled that correctly, fingers crossed, this works. Bool object has no attribute get. So there's something. Let's just pop over here. Let's just, what is it? Load .env. Is that the name of what we're, yeah, load .env. Let's just find a code example. So I'm probably using it wrong. So let's just take a quick look at the right way to do it. If we look at their docs, install, I'm using the wrong method. It is not load env, it is .env values. And then that gives us the dictionary. Load.env does something very similar but different. So let's try .env values. Let's try changing that there. And now let's run this and see how we do. So that's good. No errors. Always a good start, right? And now if I refresh, we're getting the network error again. Cores allow all origins. Should be a bool because I'm probably that should do it. I'm not. Oh, uh, yeah, I have some sort of typo here. Um, I'm not sure what it is at the moment because it's not jumping out to me.
I'm just gonna throw something out there what it could be, but I could be
Yeah.
completely off base. So I remember for like the third-party API keys, you would just have pretty much, I guess the key without the string, but then when you install the Django
Oh,
key, it would be in a string. So I don't know if it has something to do with that. Maybe.
yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. It's initially a string. I think you're right that it's a string, and that's what the error was saying, that it should be a Boolean. Let's see here. Fingers crossed. Nice. Good call, Jason. Thank you. Um, that's awesome. So this points out like the power of this, right? When we deploy to AWS, like we will tomorrow, I don't have to change my code. I just change the .env file on the server. Um, no, I need to restart the server so it reloads the .env file. Though it still doesn't. Interesting that it continues to work. I'm not gonna go down that road. Maybe I suspect maybe Boolean is like turning it into true. Like we probably need to do something like this, like if equals true. There's definitely a better way to do this. We might have to do
Francisco said eval in the chat.
eval Francisco instead of bool over here, like so. Let's see if that does it for us.
That should do it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Love it. Love it. Thank you so much. And now if we kill and restart, we should. Yeah, now it works. So yeah, thank you. So we got eval. And then what we can do, if I was going to be extra safe here, I would default this to false, right? So that if something goes wrong, we have the more secure option. So that was a little bit of a rabbit hole, but Tim, to answer your question, that's how we would do it. And there are a couple extra steps. But then once we have this right, like this is a pattern we can follow, and I just have to change one line to make a pretty significant config change, which is pretty cool.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Should we start writing some authentication code? See about logging a user in? Okay, awesome. Let's do that. And then we'll break. And then we will just keep writing more code. And let me make sure I have this set up correctly. And let's restart our server. And we're good to go. So we've got a test connection here, but this doesn't do very much, right? Though as we've seen, there's a lot of moving parts just to get the front end and back end talking to each other. Let's actually set up some of our code and logic for signing in as a user and creating an account. So I'm going to do a little copy and pasting for the sign up code, but then the logic, like for the components and the form and stuff, but the logic we'll build together. So our sign up page is pretty empty right now. It's a little sad. So let's go to the sign up page. And in the interest of time, I'm going to mostly build this in here. We are going to need to use some use state. So let's import use state. And we are going to need to use some stuff from React Bootstrap, which actually may not be installed. So let's install Bootstrap. And let's install React Bootstrap. And then with Bootstrap, I believe we'll have to add in some CSS in just a moment. But let's just make sure it was installed correctly. And it may have already been there, but reinstalling won't hurt. And let's also import, we're going to use a form from React Bootstrap /form. And let me quickly double check that I think React Bootstrap is indeed already installed because we're using it over here for the nav bar. So that was me just getting a little confused. So we should be good to go there. We're going to need to keep track of an email when a user signs up. So let's make a little bit of React component state for that on our sign up page. And we're going to need to keep track of a password. So let's keep track of that as well. And I'm going to want to have this be a React Bootstrap form. And this is where I'm going to do a little bit of copying. And we'll quickly walk through it, but mainly I just want to get us to like a working UI. So we've got a couple things to fix over here, probably a couple additional imports that need to happen. And I need a closing fragment tag for my form and my H1. And let's have VS Code do the nice work of organizing everything. And let's take a look at what we've got. So, and I'm just going to use React DevTools so we can kind of take a look at the components that we have here. So we've got a form, we've got a form label, and then a text field, and then another label and a text field. And if we look over here in the code, we can see there's a form for email address where there's a controlled component where as we type, it sets the value of our React component state for the email address, and the same thing for the password. And the button at the moment does nothing, right? So if I go up to my sign up page, as I start typing in like email and the password, we see that those are saving. But now I really need the button to do some work. So we'll come back to that in just a minute. But we need to, let's write some Axios code that's actually going to talk to the server. And what I am going to do is I'm going to just make and use this file named utilities. And we're going to add our user registration code here. And we're going to use Axios to do a little bit of setup work to make our lives easier. How are we doing, by the way? I know we're on the hour. Do we want to take a break or roll for about 10 minutes and then break?
I'd say just go till we finish this part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds good. So utilities.jsx, we've imported Axios. I'm going to make a variable called API that's going to be a helper. And if we take a look at the Axios docs, we can kind of see here that it has a method called create, and it lets us set some consistent values that it will then use all the time. And the big one is base URL. And we have an object here, and we are going to set this to localhost 8000/API, because all of our HTTP requests from Axios are going to go to our Django API server. We can set other stuff here as well, but that's really the main thing. This will make building all of our other requests a lot easier. And in fact, just to show how I can be using this, if I go back to our homepage where we're let's see here. Why are we running into an Axios error now? Is our server running? I don't think our Python server is running. There we go. So this is where it can get a little tricky to keep track of all the moving parts, and it helps just to kind of go slow. So Python server is running. Let's go back to app.jsx. Instead of using Axios, let's import API from /utilities. And over here, let's do API.get. And I don't need all of this other stuff because it's already there. I should just need lists/test. And fingers crossed, it does the job. And indeed, we make our HTTP call, and we're using our sort of utility API object that's an instance of Axios that we've configured that already has the URL that we need. And there's other stuff we're going to be able to do with this too. I just want to check it and see if folks have any questions before we then use this to build our sign up.
So is it kind of working like almost like an F string where you're like attaching what you put in the API.get and then like that continuation of the URL, the end of that?
Yeah, under the hood, I'm sure it's doing something like that. Exactly. This returns an instance of Axios, and this is already set. So exactly like you were saying, Chase, like what we have going on here is, in fact, you know, I'm sure Axios is doing something basically the same as that. Does that make sense? Awesome. So this is nice because we're going to be making lots of API calls. And for our sign up logic, we're going to need to do a bunch of stuff. So we're going to export a function and we're going to call it user registration. It's going to be an async function and it's going to take an email and a password. And we're going to need to do a bunch of things. Make the post requests, check the response, save the auth token. And this last part, I'm going to demo it, but we'll talk about it more after the break. So this part, we can use this API object that we just created. And Axios has a post method, so I can just go ahead and do this. And I can just do users/signup. And I do need to pass in the body of the requests the email and the password. Then once I get the response, let's check to see if it was successful. So a 201 is successful creation. And let's grab some user information and the token from the response data that comes back in the body of the HTTP response. And let's now save the token in local storage. And local storage is where the browser saves stuff so that even if I refresh the page, it's still there. And we'll talk a bit more about local storage after break. But let's go ahead and get this working. And the good part here is that we can set Axios to always use the auth token. And I can do this with this instance of Axios I've created. And Axios it's basically a big object, like a dictionary called defaults, where we can set default things like we do over here, right? We've set a default base URL, but we're going to set a default header and we're going to set an authorization header. And we're going to set it, and we're going to use the JavaScript version of an F string, the tag template literal, to be our token. And just for fun, let's console log that out. And we'll just say Axios default auth header. And note I'm doing this API.defaults so that everywhere I use this, this will be set. And we can just make this a single quote. I'm not sure what the squiggly here is complaining about. Yeah, we don't really need to worry about that. So I now have my post request to our endpoint to create a user. We send the email and the password. We check for a success code. And let's maybe add like an else statement that says, we'll just console log error creating user. And we'll get the errors in the in the browser and the network tab anyway. So I think that that's all I need. And we'll just have this return null just so it returns something for the time being. So now this should be ready to go and we can use it and we can hook it up to our sign up logic. So in here on the sign up component, we're going to go ahead and we're going to import user registration from utilities. And then I think really all I'm going to do is actually it needs, because we're using a form, it probably needs to be here in the on submit, if I remember correctly. So let's just make, I like making a handle. I like making handler functions. Even though it's not going to do a lot. And really all it's going to do is call user registration and pass an email and password. And then over here, I believe we do, can someone confirm for me, does this look right on submit, handle submit?
I think you also need
So,
to prevent default.
oh, we very much do need to prevent default, and it probably takes in the event here. Let's do event default. Yeah, my least favorite thing about forms. So let's clear our network tab. Let's clear all this other stuff. Let's do carol@gmail.com. I like making everyone's password. And let's make a request and see how we do. So uncaught and promises, local storage set is not a function at user registration. So this looks like probably not a typo, because if we take a look at the network tab, and this is why I do love the network tab, we can see that this post request actually did succeed. And we get back our new user, Carol, and our token. And so that part of my front end code worked great. And if we go here to look at our Django server, we see this post request. If I go into pSQL and we look at the users, we see Carol. So the issue was with my code for dealing with local storage. And this is almost definitely a relatively straightforward error to fix. And if we look at the console, local storage.set is not a function. So that almost definitely means I'm using this wrong. And the easiest way to fix that is let's just go to the MDN local storage docs and see how they say to do this and make sure I'm doing it right. And indeed, I need to say set item. So let's go ahead and change this to set item. We'll talk more about local storage after the break, but I just want to get our sign up flow working. And let's do this now for David, who will also have a password, and sort of clear the decks so we have good data if there is something else we need to debug. And the network request appeared to succeed. I'm not seeing any errors in the console. In fact, I'm seeing my print statement, which is great. That tells me that wherever I use this Axios API object, it will set the authorization header using the token for as long as we've got David logged in for. And again, we'll talk about local storage. I think we might have talked about it a little after the break, but it is essentially sort of like a little dictionary that the browser has. So that, when I refresh the page or I go here, when I refresh the page, the React app starts over and we lose everything in the running memory of our JavaScript program. But note how local storage has not gone anywhere and we still have the token so the user can grab it. So we can have the app grab it if we want to. So this is probably a good stopping point because I've been going for a minute. Why don't I take a couple questions and then we can break and then we can keep building on this. How does that sound?
Since local storage keeps data in a little dictionary, is there a reason we didn't use local storage when we were developing React apps in order to keep things like when we were building the Game of Thrones page, the actual
Right,
favorites, and store the list in that instead of the way we did
right.
it?
Great question. Um, Things get complicated with local storage because there's a couple things to remember. One is the beauty of the internet is I can log into a website from anywhere, but if I go to the library and log in, that's like local storage on that specific browser at the library. If I go then and I log into the same website later on my laptop, there's nothing from the library's local storage in my browser's local storage on my laptop. So we have to remember that the user can be logging in from different machines, and local storage is actually specific to the machine, unlike pretty much everything else. Caching also becomes an issue when like a new favorite is added or something changes on the server side. Like it actually ends up being really tricky to figure out, all right, if I have additional stuff saved in local storage, do I have to delete it? Do I have to refresh it? Do I have to grab it? Caching is actually a hard problem. And then lastly, depending on the data, there are potential security concerns. Local storage, should be pretty secure. The browser is designed that way. But, like, let's see, if I close this tab and I reopen it, and let's just go to Wikipedia and let's open up browser and let's go again to application. And let's see, they don't have local storage from where we just were. But if we go to localhost 5173, that token is still there. So like I can also close the tab. I think I can even close the browser. Session storage stuff gets deleted when the session ends. And local storage should be secure, right? But do I really want to put my bank password in it? Probably not.
No, I
So
get that.
yeah,
You wouldn't want to keep things secure, but like just storing an array in there because
right.
the way we designed it, if you refresh the page, all that data was lost anyway.
Right, exactly. And the short answer is like you absolutely can use local storage for stuff like that. What ends up being more robust is anything that we need to persist, we put on the server. And
Sure.
and yeah. And then a more advanced pattern is using local storage for caching to improve performance and stuff. But again, the scenario where like I go from my desktop to my phone is why it makes life easier to have the server be the source of truth. But you're absolutely right. Like we can and do, it just gets a little trickier. Yeah, hopefully that helps. I'll send a link. If you look up like I think it's called there's a word for it that's escaping me. Progressive web apps. Like you can build a web app that will work offline because it's putting stuff in local storage, but it ends up the more places you have to keep track of stuff, the trickier it gets. Yeah, great question. What other questions do folks have? What's on people's minds about this code that we wrote here? Because this is sort of the key thing, right? I think the rest of this we've seen, but this is the big change now in how we're writing our front end code and using Axios. All right, let's take 10 And then when we come back, we'll just keep building out the front end, right? We've dealt with cores, we've done sort of all the hard work. Now we can see, hey, I've got this auth header saved. I can do some nice stuff now, like create task lists and look at task lists, and we'll see how to modify our front end code to do that. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good break, and I'll definitely get away from the screen, and I'll see you all in 10 minutes. Okay, so just to recap what we did over the break is we implemented code to create a user. Where we send a post request. Oh yeah, it's this lightning here. With an email and a password. And then Django sends a 201 created response, success response back, right? And it has in the body of that response, let's see what it has in the body of that response. If we do evan@gmail.com with a password, and I clear this, what do we currently send back? We currently send back just a username and then, of course, the all-important auth token. So this now gives us what we need to do more stuff, right? Because now I actually have what I need to make lists and all the other things, but I need to get this data, the user information and the token to the other parts of my React app. And we started to see that with local storage, where what we do in our code, and I'm going to close this out for just a little more real estate, is when our post request succeeds to create a user, local storage is a very simple key value store where we give it the name of a key and we save the token there. We also hold our Axios API object to always send an authorization header with the value being token, so that all our future API calls now have the auth token. So we have, in effect, a logged in user. And if we go to here, application, we see local storage. As you can sort of tell by looking at local storage is restricted by origin. And you can actually go in and manually delete stuff, right? And this is one of the challenges with local storage is we can't always rely on it. Very briefly to talk about local storage, and let me just kind of scroll down to the relevant part of our curriculum. There's a couple key things to remember with local storage. Even closing and reopening the browser does not get rid of local storage data. Session storage, it does. So this data persistence can be good and bad, right? But it's important to remember whatever you put in local storage will stick around. Local storage and session storage are both key value pairs. There is a storage limit in the browser of a couple megabytes. That's usually not a concern because you usually stick little bits of text in local storage. Local storage also follows the same origin policy. If I go to Wikipedia, JavaScript on the Wikipedia from Wikipedia running in my browser can't grab that local storage token from our React app. That would be a huge security risk, right? If I could go to sketchywebsite.com and it loaded some JavaScript in my browser that grabbed like local storage stuff that like, my bank website had put in my local storage. We use this local storage object in JavaScript to get data or set data. There's no natural expiration for local storage, so we do have to manage it. We'll learn about cookies later, but other ways of storing stuff kind of expire after a certain amount of time. We have to think about page performance. This isn't immediately relevant, but it is a synchronous operation. So if we have a lot going on, it could block something else. Even though the browser does a good job of making local storage secure, security is all about defense in depth, one layer after another. So we don't really want to put anything sensitive in local storage. For learning, putting the auth token in there is fine. That's also, by the way, like raise your hand if you've logged into a website, close the browser, and you've come back an hour later and you're still logged in. So 5 gets you 10. That was done with local storage. That some sort of auth token was saved in your browser's local storage. But if you come back 2 days later, you're not still logged in, right? And what happens on the server side, and we'll learn this later with Django, is that, and we might have talked about it a little bit yesterday, but auth tokens can expire, right? And so there's a lot of server-side security stuff we can do so that auth tokens expire so that it's relatively safe to leave it in local storage. So if I'm Chase Bank, maybe I decide that an auth token expires after 30 minutes and I want a really strict expiration timeline. And that makes putting it auth token in local storage more secure. Finally, some browsers might not have local storage. Anything that the user can go in and mess with, we can't totally rely on. So it's important to have fallbacks. So what we're going to do now is we have to get the user information out of our sign-up page and into the top level of our app, right? Because I want to be able to pass this information around to other places like the home page and stuff like that. And you can see here that we have this code where we've created a user. We have a simple test connection use effect that we run. And in fact, I should make sure. Can someone remind me, what does this empty array do here with use effect?
Use effect will watch whatever you put in there to see if you want to rerun the use effect, if that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, I'm surprised I didn't end up with an infinite loop like this, because I feel like in the past, that's an issue I've seen where if we don't have the empty array, the use effect just keeps firing. So what I'm going to do now is another use effect, and we're just going to have it watch the user state. And remember, this is at the very top level of our React app. So we're going to be able to pass this state down. And this is really just going to be a helper for us. I'm just going to say app state user, and we'll just print out the user, and we'll have it watch that. So as the user changes. So how do I pass user and set user to my different pages?
Context.
Yeah, exactly. Right. We're using React Router and we have routing going on. So I need to use the React Router outlet context object. And in here, we will pass in user and set user. And now, and there's some sort of error I will trace down.
There's an equal sign, right? Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. And now, any component rendered inside the outlet has access to the context. And if we go here to our app and we use my favorite tool of React DevTools to look at the component tree, And our sign up page, well, all the way up here somewhere is the outlet. Let's close out the nav bar. Here's the outlet. And then way inside the outlet is the sign up page. And as I navigate around, let's see here. Do we have an error? Is this just React DevTools complaining? I think that was just React DevTools complaining. As we navigate around, if you look all the way down at the bottom here, right, different pages get rendered inside the outlet based on our routing. And so, and let me close up this nav bar that we don't really care about. And so now what I can do is I can grab user and set user from the outlet context, and I can use it in our user registration code. And let me go ahead and make that modification now. And I think there's a couple different ways to do it. I think the easiest way is here if we go to our sign up page and we import, is it use outlet context? And then over here, we grab that user from use outlet context. Over here, once all this stuff succeeds, I can go ahead and I can call set user. What I really want though is I want to make sure that this works. And I think it also might be good for user registration to return something. So if we hop over to our user registration code and we look at what we have going on here, right now we're not returning anything at all. Let's go ahead and let's return the user here. And then here, let's just return return null. And there's some better ways to do that, but that's not the worst way to do it. And in fact, the red squigglies are correct. We don't even need the else now that we have return user. So I think we might need a little bit of air handling here to make sure that this works nicely. I think I'll just add a to-do comment to that fact. Do we need to, we might want to throw an error here, depending on how we do this. But what we can do here is we can do await user registration. I might have to turn some of this into an async function to get this to work. So give me just one moment to make sure I have this code right. As there's a couple different ways to do it. And I think we can do something like that. And so now we're using this set user from use outlet context. Handle submit is now an async function. I might need to wrap it in something for it to work here. I think this will be okay, but we'll see. Um, and we prevent default. We grab the user. We make sure the user exists, that it's not returning null, and then we set the user if we've succeeded on login. So let's run this and see if this works. I might have to make one or two tweaks here, but I think we're pretty close. So I think we're now on like F or G. So let's do Gary@gmail.com and we'll do password and we'll clear the network tab as well. And we'll run this. And that seemed to work, right? Gary's created. And we see this nice print statement, app state user, Gary@gmail. And that's coming from here. So what that tells me is that the signup code worked, that handle submit fired off our user registration logic, which succeeded. With async await, we get the user from Django. The user is truthy, so we call set user. We then update user state here at the app level. And because that's changed, that fires this use effect. So I now have user information that I can pass around anywhere through this context, such as a profile page and so on and so forth. And you can also see how you could use this same pattern to pass other data around if you needed to. So in a minute, let's go ahead and implement like login and logout, but I just want to check in to see if folks have questions or are curious about stuff.
Can you go back to the sign up JSX page?
Yeah, totally.
Are you utilizing context here in the app?
Just a little bit. We are grabbing set user, and set user comes from app.
Mhm.
Here, so top level here for app, we're creating user and set user as component states so that we can pass it as context
Yeah.
into all the children. And then on the sign up page, we grab set user from the outlet context. And then here in my function to handle, submitting my information when I want to sign up, I've got an async await that does our user registration logic, talking to Django, making the HTTP request. And really, this should throw an error if it fails. If it succeeds, it returns a user. I've added sort of an extra check here to make sure there's actually something here. And then we just set our app state user to that.
But if you had additional items in outlet context, wouldn't you have to specify where an outlet context set user is coming from? No, never mind. Set user is the name of disregard.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah,
you're
you're
good.
good to go.
You're
You're good
good.
to go. There's a lot of moving parts,
Yeah, no, I
right?
got it.
Yeah. Because I mean, we spent a good 45 minutes just walking through the Django code. Um, but this is really cool because now we have a good pattern and we can use this. And you have a skeleton here for sign up and login logic. Um, let's go ahead and let's write some login code. And let me go ahead and pull up utilities here. And I'm going to give us a little more room and we'll just kind of write it as we go. And a lot of this, to be honest, is going to be similar to our user registration code. And in fact, I'll just pull up utilities here too. And we can kind of leave that there as a reference. And let's write some user login code. And it's going to look pretty similar. So again, we're going to make an API call, not using Axios directly, but the Axios object we created. And we need to pass in our email and password. And I actually need to put a wait in front of that because this is an asynchronous call. So now we've made our HTTP call to Django. Django should be sending us back user information and the token. Let's check. This is going to be a 200 response. The 201 is for creating. 200 is a general success message. Let's destructure the response data object that has the HTTP response body to grab the user and the token information. And now we do pretty much the same thing we did for signup. We'll do local storage set item. We'll make a note for later about checking if a token already exists. We'll worry about that later. And we'll do API defaults, headers, common. And you could write a helper function to reduce some duplication of code, but that's not critical for right now. And I am going to steal this console log statement in this return user just to keep life simple. And if it fails, let's just console log login error. And we might as well just console log the response. And let's return null. And so now I have some user login logic. And again, you can see how once you have a good pattern, you can really reuse it and it makes life easier. I just want to check in to see if folks have any questions about the login code here. Okay, cool. Let's open up our login page, which is pretty empty right now. And I am going to do some copying and pasting here, just in the interest of time. We're going to grab a bunch of different things. We're going to get our imports. We're going to be definitely using use state. We're definitely going to be using our buttons. As you can imagine, we're going to be using outlet context, and we're going to be using user login from utilities. And I do want to just make sure I have that path right, and it does look right. So our login component is going to need some component state of its own. It's going to need it's going to be very similar to registration. We're going to need email and password. And we're going to grab set user from the outlet context. And I'm going to give myself a fragment to do all my work in. And let's now go to the login page and we can watch this grow as we build it. And also make sure I don't have errors as I go. So I am going to do a big old copy paste here. And then we can walk through what it's doing. And we're going to use a very similar pattern. And we'll tackle whatever that error is in just a second. Let's see here. Login line 5, user login from -- utilities. The requested module does not provide an export named user login. That probably means I just got something wrong with my name. And indeed, I have a lowercase I here. And just for consistency, we'll make it uppercase. And now we're cooking. So there's a lot of copy and paste here. We've got a form, right? We have an email field. We have a password field. Both of these are controlled components in the pattern we've seen. We have a submit button. The example code here does use a slightly different pattern for calling for doing the handling. And I think they're both good to see. One way is you write a handle method like this and you use it here. If you prefer, you can do it this way where we have an async function. I haven't seen this as much, but I believe actually then each of these gets executed one after another. And it's really a little bit of dealer's choice. We'll see if there is a syntax error here that needs to be resolved, but the core thing is, again, we call user login, which makes our HTTP request. This is async. This will return the user when it succeeds, and we will go ahead and set it. And I've been making so many users, but I think the last one I made was Gary. So let's try logging in Gary. And I think what would be helpful is let's get some information so that we know that Gary's logged in, right? So over here, we have this, we have this. We don't really need this anymore. Let's just console log and say user login success, and we will print out the user. I think I actually want to go to the nav bar. And I think what I actually want to do here is let's import use outlet context. And let's grab the user from the outlet context. And let's see here, cannot destructure property user of use outlet context as it is null. Interesting. I wonder what I did. Oh, I know the problem. So the problem is I forgot that the nav bar is not inside our outlet. So it doesn't have access to outlet context. So in order to pass in the user, we're going to do it the simple way as a prop, which is actually great because props are simple. And now over here, let's add some sort of nav bar field for something. Maybe what we'll just do is we'll do something like login, like let's just put the user's email maybe after all of this stuff, because we have sign up, we have login, we have log out. Let's just do maybe nav.item, and let's just do user.email. And now we, of course, run into this issue of if user's there. So let's do if user exists, we'll show the user.email. Otherwise, we'll show an empty string. And that should solve that problem. Now, I don't remember exactly what the user object returns, so we might have to come back and tweak this later. But this should get us going. And now we'll get something nice when login works. So now let's go ahead and here's our login code. Let's go ahead and try to log in and actually, let's take this a step further. Let's make sure we delete the token from local storage. And that's actually super important because otherwise it might be set as being sent by Axios, depending on if we've like refreshed the page or not. So let's just refresh the page too, just to be safe. Right, that's an easy gotcha. It's easy to lose like hours, and then you realize there was like a token in local storage all along. So everyone's password is password. Our login request appears to succeed. We don't get back a lot of user information. It just says unknown. So I probably need to modify my navbar code for the moment just to show some simpler message. But we see here in the console state user unknown because in fact we don't get the user's username. So why don't we in fact go to our Django code and let's go to one of our views for the user app and let's find the login view. Let's see here. And let's maybe modify what this returns. And right now this returns just a name, but let's have it return email and display name. And we'll do a little formatting. And now if I log in as Gary, we get some nicer stuff. And if you all can see up here, it's not pretty, but our nav bar shows Gary's email. Right. So we've successfully logged in and we're successfully passing data around because once I pass set user down through the outlet context, I can basically set this user from anywhere in my app, and then we can pass it in here to the nav bar. So I just want to pause and check in and see what questions folks have around this login code and how we're feeling about stuff. We doing pretty good? Or
We're
how
going to have
are
to get
people
some
doing?
hands-on to really get it.
Yeah, I think, again, the key thing here to remember is there's kind of two levels to think about this, right? What's our endpoint for logging in? Users/login. Big picture, the same way we would with Postman, we need our React app to send an API call to the server to log the user in. And whenever a user logs in, there's no auth token, right? So I've got to send my email or my username and my password. And both for logging in and creating an account, Django sends back some information about the user, really whatever we want, and most importantly, the auth token. And so here in our JavaScript code, this utilities file, this is really like our API file. We're building our API code here. And so our API code uses Axios to make a post request to that login endpoint with the email and the password. And we check to see if it succeeded. And if it did, we're going to save the auth token in local storage, and we're going to set it so that all our future API calls from our React code from over here will have the auth token, which we haven't had a chance to see, which I do apologize about. And then if there's an error, we throw an error. And we call this from our login page. And there's a lot of stuff here, but you guys have built the React Pokédex. You know what a form looks like, right? And so the important piece here is what happens when I click submit to log in on the form. And we call our user login function. We pass it the email and the password. And this will get us the user information from Django. And here we use React's outlet context, right? And here's where, if I go back to app.jsx, where the fact that we made this React component state at the very top of our React component tree, and then all these pages that are inside the outlet have access to this so that this set user can be used over here to update the user for everyone, right, at the top level of the app. Does it help a bit to walk through the flow that way? Cool. So let's implement log out, right? And I might steal a little bit of time going into lunch, but we can also see some good things around application flow. So log out is going to be relatively straightforward. We have a nav bar and we have a log out button. So we're gonna want, there it is. We're gonna call our logout code from here. Our logout code is going to be pretty similar to all the other code we've written. Once again, it's going to be an async function. We're going to make an HTTP request using our Axios API that we built. And we're going to make a post request to log out to the user/logout endpoint. I don't need a username or password for logout. And authorization header is already set, right? So this post request is going to have the authorization header set because our user is already logged in or registered. And when we do that, we set this default authorization header for all future API calls with Axios. And so that's how Django is going to know what user wants to log out here. We're going to check to see that we got the right kind of success response code. And if we have, we're going to remove the token from local storage because we're logging the user out. And we're going to delete that shared header. You know, maybe I have two different accounts here, right? So we're properly logging the user out. And we're going to return null. Let's actually return true. And we'll just put a console log here and we'll just say like logged out. And this, I have a couple typos in my code. That's one. Avoid the delete operator, which can impact performance. Does it have a quick fix? Use a literal key instead, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, it doesn't really matter. And we'll just have a simple error message. We'll say, you know, user logout failed error responses, and we'll put the response here. And if it fails, we'll return false, just so I have something to work with. So this is my logout code, right? We make the post request, it succeeds, we remove the auth token from local storage, we get rid of it from the comment headers. Now let's go ahead and let's use that in our navbar. Let me open up our front end navbar. And here for logout, which is kind of hiding from me, we'll do on click. And this will need to be an async function. And we'll actually just sort of clear the user as well so that we can clear it from the sidebar. So we'll actually have to pass in set user here. And let's import user logout. And we'll call our user logout code here. I kind of like the handler pattern, but both of these work. Once this gets big enough, I do like to reformat. I think it's a bit easier to read this and see what's going on. Now, I do need to make sure here I pass in set user as a prop to the navbar. So let's do that now. So let's see if this works. So I'm refreshing my page. No one's logged in, though there is an auth token. Let's just go ahead and let's log in as Gary. Success. Now let's try logging out. Also success. We see our logged out message with its typo. We see Gary disappeared from up here. if I go to look at local storage, token is gone. Gary has indeed been logged out. So I just want to check in and see what questions folks have around sort of this logout logic. We feeling okay? Cool. So it'd be nice if like once I log in, if I close the tab and come back in 10 minutes, we can use this token that we have. So let's see how we can do this so that I can get some fancier behavior. And we're going to write a method called user confirmation in utilities. And then we're going to use it so that here, like once I log in, if I refresh the page, it'll keep me logged in, which will let us do lots of nice stuff. So it's going to be like everything else in async function. And what we're going to do is we're going to grab the token from local storage. We've been putting it there. We've been doing set item. We're finally going to do get item. And we're going to check if it exists, right? Because maybe the user has not logged in at all. But if the user previously has logged in, let's go ahead and use that token. And I think what the squigglies are telling me is that I can do it. I can set the authorization header like this, which is a bit nicer. And let's go ahead and let's just get some information about our user. Let's hit our user's info endpoint. In fact, let's maybe add as a to-do, like get the user's lists, but we'll come back to that in a sec. And let's just add a console log here and we'll say user confirmation success, user info, and we'll print out here as well, response data user. And otherwise, we'll just return null and we'll do a console log and we'll say user, not logged in. And over here, we'll add a console log and we'll say user logged in, but get users failed. And we'll print the response. And so now when I call this, we'll look for our token in local storage. If we have it, we'll set it as the default header, and then we'll try and use it to get some user data as a sanity check and to sort of make life nicer. So now let's see how we can use this. And this is a little tricky because what I really want is when I'm here, I don't want that. When I'm here on my homepage, right? It'd be nice to see some information. Like let's in fact just add like just maybe an H2. Actually I should go to the homepage and let's add here a fragment. Let's put this there. Let's grab use outlet context. Outlet context. Let's grab the user from use outlet context. And let's say, username. If there is a user dot display name, or Nothing. And let's say we'll change this to display name so I don't get confused. And we'll say email. And again, we can do the same thing here. And so this way now when I log in, I see something and it's a little more interesting. And we can also tell if this works or not. Because again, what I really want is I refresh the page. And if I already logged in, I want to see my info. But that means that I need to somehow call this user confirmation function I made and make this API call before this homepage component loads, right? Now, I could sort of put it in here and do it that way, but React Router actually gives us a really nice way to do this with something called a loader. Have we seen or talked about loaders? And we may not have.
It doesn't sound familiar.
Yeah. So as the name implies, a loader is a function that React Router will call before loading a page. So what I can actually do here for our whole app is loader user confirmation. And before this app component loads, and it's always the first thing that loads, React Router will call this code, right? So we could have other loaders for here and here and here, but since the user is useful for everything, it's kind of nice to do it here at the top level. So now we do have to make a change in the app component so that we can use this loader information. And we do that by, we are going to import use loader data. And actually it's coming from the same place as that, so we can put use loader data here. I wasn't sure if it was exactly the same library. And then here in our app, what we can do is we can use it to grab our user information. Let's just call it like const loaded user equals use loader data. And we can set this to loaded user. And now, before the app component renders, the loader fires. If we've logged in, it'll grab the token, it'll set it, it'll make an HTTP request to get user info, and it will stick it in the app component. So let's watch this in action. First, I'm going to go to the login page. I'm going to make sure I don't have a token. I don't. We're going to do gary@gmail.com. We've successfully logged Gary in. I'm going to go ahead and clear the console, clear the network. And this is where, like, as you work on this stuff, like every single click kind of matters to test and have a good debugging workflow. So what I'm going to do is, well, let's go to the home page. And I'm going to do a hard refresh, right? So the token is going to stay, but I'm going to refresh this page. And let's watch what happens when I do. And we do have an error. You defined a loader for route 0, but didn't return anything from your loader function. Please return a value or null. Sounds like the best kind of error to fix. So let's go to our utilities. I do return something here. I don't return anything here. We did get our user info, but I must have screwed up this response.data.user because it's undefined right here. So let's go to the network tab and let's look at the response. And the issue is this whole object is just on response.data. not dot user. So the fix should be pretty simple. The fix should just be that. And that does appear to work. And if we test this now, we can do a hard refresh. And I can do a hard refresh a bunch of times. It's Command Shift R on a Mac, which clears the cache. I think it's Control Shift R on Windows. And to really test this, we can delete our token. And now if I do a hard refresh, we see that we don't get Gary's information. So now we get to really leverage local storage, right? Every time we go here, it will load this page. And it should work too if I go to other pages as well. And just to take this home, because it'd be really nice to see some lists, let's grab the user's lists and show those, and then we can wrap up because I realize I've ran a little long. Sound good? Okay, thank you. I'm going to use my own code here as a bit of a guide. The good news here is we don't need to do a ton of stuff because get lists is going to be an async function. The authorization header is already set because the user is logged in. So I just need to make my API call. And it's going to be await API.get. And I think now I will hop over to Postman real quick to kind of remind myself. And I believe it is API/lists is all I need. So it's just going to be lists to do it. And if response.status is 200, let's console.log get lists success, and let's console log our response data. And let's return response.data. And over here, we'll just console log get lists error response return null. And this is a pretty good start. We're going to need to do a bit more. I think we're going to need to do something with the lists, but I think this actually gets us pretty far. And so what I want to do now is just to keep things simple here on the home page. Let's add some component state. And it's just going to be lists and set lists. And it's going to be an empty array to start with. And for the moment, I'm just going to console log the lists in the interests of time. So I don't have to worry about rendering names and things like that, but we'll add that later. And what we'll do is we'll do a use effect hook. And what we'll do in here is we are going to import our get lists. And I indeed forgot to export it. So that ought to solve the issue I was running into there. And I'm going to call, we're going to do, this is going to have to be an async function. And we're going to do, we'll call it response data equals await get lists. Let's just console log it right here. So we can debug. Hopefully that works. And then we can do set lists. response data. And we'll see if I need to deal with a different shape of anything or anything like that. But I think this gets us pretty far. I do have a bunch of squigglies here. So I think let's just, this is going to be a little messy, but I just want to get this working. I'm sure there's a better pattern to this that is escaping my mind at the moment, but this way we're working. And now we can do just and we'll get this. So there's probably one or two things we're going to have to debug with this, but let's see how we do. So first we got to log in. And now I'm successfully logged in as Gary. Now it looks like it indeed did. I'm not sure exactly why it hit the list's endpoint there. We'll have to cross that bridge in a minute. But the moment of truth should be when I navigate to the home page. And we made our API call, but we didn't get anything back, which would make sense because Gary doesn't have any lists, but we did have someone who does. As we go way back in time, Bob has lists. So let's log out and let's log in as Bob. And I'll bring up the homepage here so we can see. And we can see we're logged in as Bob. And ignoring all that and ignoring all this pop-up stuff, what we see here is we indeed do get Bob's lists, which indeed are an array of objects. And if we go through the tasks, we can very quickly, and I think this is a good stopping point, I think this is probably a good stopping point here because I would love to get us home by showing something more visual, but that will take a bit more work because we just have nested lists. But you all can see here that we are successfully getting lists back, and we can see it here in the console log as well. And at this point, because we've added this to state, we really have a lot of control, right? If I want some top level stuff here, we can do it like that. We can pass it in through outlet context. And then on our homepage, we could do lists, set lists. And then at that point now, we have our list data at the top level of our app. If I go all the way up here and we close out all this navigation stuff and we go to app, we can see here, we've got hiding in here our task list in the React component state for our app. And at this point, I will stop here, but I think you all can see the pattern that we could use where this user confirmation call, it could also fire off get lists, right? So that when you come back, if the auth token is there, we grab the lists and we show them. And now using the techniques you learned from the React Pokemon page, you can build a lists page and an add list and so on and so forth. So I realized I ran long here, so thank you all very much for being patient. I hope it was useful to see this and go through this. Let's definitely break for lunch. I'm more than happy to stick around to answer questions, but let me go ahead and stop the recording.